If you grew up religious, chances are you've probably heard a lot of sermons just like this one.
God created sex, and that he desires it to be within marriage and commands that its bed be kept pure. And I also want to state that all sexual activity that is outside of marriage is wrong.
And that's why I still have nightmares about Satan sneaking into my bedroom, wearing a slutty outfit, and turning me into damaged goods. Jokes aside, I must admit that something always felt off about the whole no sex before marriage thing, even when I was a Christian. And now I know why. It was never about holiness. It was about oppression. Because the truth is, Christianity has been weaponized, turned into a tool of control that turns women into baby-making machines and men into money-making machines. And the most sinister part is, we all participate in this system, even if we're not consciously aware of it. In order to understand how millions of Christians around the country have been deceived, though, let's get into the psychology of purity culture. But first, we must understand what purity culture really is, and why I can say for certain that it's not backed up by anything in the Bible. So let's break out my old friend for just a second, and let's read the verse together that every preacher or minister would cite as the best argument against sex before marriage in the Bible. Let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 18 in the King James Version, where it says, "Flee fornication. Every sin that a man doeth is without the body, but he that committeth fornication sinneth against his own body." This fornication word might sound really confusing or foreign to you, and that's because it is. Knowing this, many preachers will take advantage of the fact that most people don't know better, and will interpret fornication to mean any kind of sex outside of marriage, including sex before marriage. But the truth is, not every preacher has actually done their homework on the origin of the word fornication. So I decided to dive a little deeper into the history of sex before marriage in the Bible by doing what anyone else would, going onto YouTube and looking it up. I ended up finding a very helpful video by this guy named Dan Mclellan, who's a Bible scholar who puts a strong emphasis on changing cultural norms throughout the history of the Bible.
What does the Bible have to say about sex before marriage? Hey everybody, I'm Dan Mclellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion, and the fit for this video is the X-Men cartoon. And the Bible doesn't have a whole lot to say directly about sex before marriage, and what it does have to say is inconsistent and sometimes contradicting. And that's because each author is presenting their own sexual ethic based on their own social mores and conventions, and so there's no single consistent sexual ethic.
And with his help, I was able to dig into the original Hebrew and Greek of this verse in order to actually decipher the original intent of the authors.
In the Hebrew Bible, there's no real sacrality associated with the act of sex itself. It is the social implications that are the primary driver of the regulations that are placed on sex. And if you had to distill the sexual ethics of the Hebrew Bible down to the shortest list of principles, it would probably be that sex before marriage should only happen if it ends up in marriage, and also men can visit sex workers without any problem. Women were viewed as sexual commodities.
So now we can easily see how the whole idea of purity culture, not having sex before marriage, is less of a divinely inspired command and more of a shifting cultural norm. But Max, how do shifting cultural norms in Christianity relate in any way to male psychology? Well, the reason for the translation errors I mentioned earlier lies in the subconscious desires of the men who were in charge of translating the Bible. They wanted to achieve something called paternity certainty. What is paternity certainty, you may ask? In order to understand that, we have to go back to before humans even existed, as males across all species who do the dirty have always had the same problem. They have no way of knowing whether their mate's kids are actually theirs. The most important instincts for any creature on Earth are to survive and to reproduce, to pass on your genes. But part of passing on your genes involves ensuring the survival of your offspring that actually carry your genes. And that requires a certain amount of fatherly investment in the form of time and resources. Knowing this, it would not serve, say, a male sparrow's goals to gather up some grub for a baby sparrow that was conceived by some canoodling in a bush that his mate did with a rival male sparrow. So yeah, it follows that this male sparrow would want to make sure that the baby sparrows that he invests time and resources into raising are actually his own. Now, humans are a lot more complex than sparrows, but at our core, we human men still desire paternity certainty, even if we don't realize it. And it just so happens that one of the best ways for us human men to achieve paternity certainty is to mate with a virgin woman, because you can't be uncertain about who the father is if you're the only one who's been in the sheets with her. But now the question becomes, how does a male who possesses outlier intelligence compared to all other animals make sure that his wife is a virgin? Simple, by creating a social construct that ensures females don't have sex with anyone until they are pair bonded, and punishes females for leaving these established pair bonds. That is why marriage was created.
Because women were viewed as sexual commodities, and so their sexual integrity and purity was what they were primarily paying for when they paid the bride price. So women were expected to be virgins.
An important thing to note here is that marriage has changed quite a lot since the time of Jesus, but the core idea of committing socially and sexually to one other person remains unchanged. So what better way is there to encourage women to be virgins until marriage than to shame them and socially ostracize them for having sex before or outside of marriage? None that I can think of, at least none that don't explicitly use violence to control women. Explicitly. So this is why purity culture exists. It's a socially enforced expectation for women to be abstinent until marriage in order for the men under the system to have paternity certainty and ensure that their genes get passed on. The thing is, if you're a man watching, this probably doesn't sound too bad. Sure, you're not going to have as much casual sex, but at least you're guaranteed a wife who will carry your children while you go out and work or chill and have a beer with the homies. Even when you take that into account though, what if I told you that you are just as much of a prisoner to the system that purity culture enforces as your hypothetical wife is? The system in question is American capitalism. But for now, let's focus on men. Let's take a look at what your value is to the elites of society as a man under capitalism. In other words, what specific skills do you bring to the table that are useful to help keep society running? And what differentiates you from the other men who specialize in the same field as you? The harsh truth is, your worth, your usefulness under capitalism, which is determined by how much money you make, has nothing to do with how hard you actually work or how necessary your job is to keep society running. Rather, it has everything to do with how easy you are to replace, which in simpler terms means what level of education or training does someone need in order to be qualified to do your job. This is why construction workers, for example, get paid less than lawyers, because even though construction workers risk their lives every day to build new buildings for people to use, it takes years of higher education before a law student could even think about getting hired by a law firm. Okay, I know what you're thinking. Max, why did you bring up the job market in a video about purity culture? Think about it for a second. If the value of a woman under purity culture is reduced to her ability to attract a high-quality man, the value of a man under purity culture is reduced to how much money he can make in order to provide for his family and be useful to the elites. You, as an employee, are nothing more than a cog in a machine that hides behind conservative Christian family values values, but really only exists to serve the elite and the billionaires, people who Jesus certainly would have hated. You may think that you're providing for your family, but you're also providing the labor necessary for the men who are already worth the most in this society to increase their wealth even more. Because let's face it, to him, you are merely a tool, not a human being. And by the way, this applies to anyone in the workforce, not just men. If you have a job and you're watching this video, your boss has no incentive to actually see you as a person, only to hire whoever can provide the best, most cost-efficient labor in order to turn the largest profit possible. To them, you are no different than a screwdriver or a forklift. And that's why inventions like the IBM computer replaced jobs like human calculators back in the 50s. And that's why AI is going to take your job the second it can do it more effectively than you can. If it's more cost efficient for the elites, your needs are secondary to the profit incentive for the billionaires that purity culture is designed to hold up. So now we get to the part where I talk about the intersection of capitalism and purity culture, because I wasn't super clear before. The first thing you need to understand is that purity culture doesn't exist on its own. It's part of a larger political and religious project, conservative evangelical Christianity. It's well known that over 70% of evangelical Christians voted for Trump in the 2024 election. So let's start with him. If we take a serious look at the Trump administration's policies and psychological tactics, we can find an extremely obvious pattern, attempting to control and silence vulnerable Americans like undocumented immigrants by literally sending them to concentration camps, all under the guise of Christian values.
Bible verse I think about sometimes, many times. It goes, "And I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send? And who will go for us? Sooner or later, God will cut you down." And I said, "Here am I. Send me."
Another pattern we can't help but notice is his willingness to accept bribes from ultra-rich, corrupt governments, which is shown by his friendliness towards the governments of Israel and Saudi Arabia. An even more obvious thing that we need to point out about Trump is that he, at his core, is a businessman operating under the system of American capitalism, a system designed with the incentive to make as much money as possible, rather than to actually help people. When we combine all of those points into a sort of grand design, we can start to see Trump's true goal: to gain as much wealth as possible for himself and his billionaire homies by any means necessary. And yes, he will go as low as he has to achieve this goal, even if it means manipulating the existing frustrations that many people, but especially men, have with their current living situations. All the while, Trump never actually does anything to improve these people's situations. In fact, he does quite the opposite, widening the wealth gap by imposing pointless tariffs and passing corporate tax breaks that only benefit the juggernauts of capitalism, the elites. But like I said before, he could not have done this without manipulating the frustration that evangelical Christian men already had about the state of the world and turning them against stuff like feminism and illegal immigration in order to distract them from the real enemy, the ultra-rich. So at long last, we have uncovered the true link between purity culture and capitalism. But purity culture is not the only mechanism of control used by conservative Christianity. Don't believe me? Let's look at the psychology of pro-life rhetoric for a second. It uses religious values that aren't even backed up by scripture to enforce control over the bodily autonomy of women by forcing them to carry a fetus, even if it would cause them to have major life consequences, unspeakable emotional pain, and in extreme cases, the death of the mother. If a woman's ability to choose whether or not to carry a fetus in her womb is up to greedy, powerful men, they will always choose the option that is most likely to grant them paternity certainty. The ability to hook up with multiple hot models and guarantee that if he gets them pregnant, he will have passed on his genes and achieved paternity certainty. And since it's not in the interest for women to raise a child alone, women are in turn less likely to have casual sex, meaning more men will get to marry a virgin. And we can see the same pattern with homophobic rhetoric, transphobic rhetoric, anti-immigration rhetoric, and to some extent, even anti-vax rhetoric. They all involve control through misdirecting people's frustrations anywhere but the ultra-rich, who are the real enemies here. And they are the puppeteers who financially benefit from conservative economic policies. Once you see this pattern of enforcing paternity certainty through social control and political control being legislation, you simply can't unsee it. These regressive ideas exist only to serve wealthy, powerful men by exploiting you. And that is why I think it is time for us to collectively move on from purity culture. And no, this doesn't just mean not voting for conservatives. It means no longer judging women based on their body count. No more shaming women for showing off too much skin or being immodest. But it also means no longer reducing the value of men to what they can provide, and actually listening to the silent struggles of men that are affecting their mental health. Most importantly, though, moving on from purity culture means no longer blindly doing what we're told in a system that is designed to exploit us and benefit the ultra-rich. Then, and only then, can we begin to create a better world, not only for ourselves, but for future generations as well. And my greatest hope is that those future generations will never have to feel the pain or the exploitation of purity culture anywhere but the history books. It's not going to be easy, but I truly believe that this vision is possible. So I ask you, if you've made it this far, to support my work by liking the video, subscribing to my channel, and checking out another one of my videos down below so that I can continue to expose the underlying psychology of systemic oppression. As always, I hope you all have a fantastic day. Peace.